A shot rang through the crisp Montana air, sending Meredith O'Connor's horse into a frenzied panic that changed the course of her life forever. The year was 1876, and what had begun as a peaceful morning ride across her father's sprawling ranch had transformed into a terrifying ordeal as her chestnut mare bolted wildly toward the edge of a steep ravine. Meredith fought desperately to regain control, her knuckles white against the reins as the wind whipped her auburn hair from its careful pins. Her heart thundered in her chest, matching the relentless pounding of hooves against the hard, packed earth. The mare's nostrils flared with each panicked breath, deaf to Meredith's desperate pleas. "Whoa, please stop," she cried, her voice lost to the wind as the ravine edge grew closer. Terror seized her lungs as she realized what was coming. The horse veered suddenly, and Meredith felt herself slip from the saddle, her body launched through the air like a rag doll tossed by a careless child. Time seemed to slow as she fell, the ground rushing up to meet her. In that suspended moment between horse and earth, Meredith caught a glimpse of movement, a blur of denim and leather appearing from nowhere. Strong arms suddenly enveloped her, catching her with such force that both she and her rescuer tumbled to the ground in a controlled fall. The man had twisted his body to take the brunt of the impact, cradling her against his chest as they rolled once, twice, before coming to stop with Meredith pressed against him, both of them breathing heavily. "Are you all right, miss?" The voice was deep and steady, despite what had just occurred. Meredith looked up to find herself staring into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath a well-worn Stetson. Yes, I think so," she managed, suddenly aware of their improper position. The stranger seemed to realize it at the same moment, gently helping her to sit up. "Name's Kieran Hayes," he said, standing to dust himself off before offering her his hand. "Folks call me Kier." Meredith accepted his help, rising to her feet on shaky legs. "Meredith O'Connor," she replied, attempting to regain her composure while straightening her riding skirt. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Hayes, if you hadn't been there." Kieran's eyes scanned the horizon, tracking her runaway horse, which had stopped its mad dash and was now nervously pawing at the ground some distance away. "No thanks needed, Miss O'Connor. Just happened to be in the right place." He whistled, and to Meredith's surprise, the mare's ears perked up. "Your horse seems to have calmed down," he noted. "What spooked her?" "A gunshot," Meredith said, her voice steadier now. "Someone must be hunting on our property, though Father has posted it clearly." Kieran's expression darkened slightly. "Hunters shouldn't be this close to your ranch house." He gestured toward her home, visible as a distant white structure nestled against the backdrop of pine trees. "I'll fetch your horse for you." As he walked toward the mare, Meredith took the opportunity to properly look at her rescuer. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the saddle, tall and broad-shouldered in a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. His dark hair curled slightly where it escaped his hat, and a day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw. Everything about him spoke of life on the range. With gentle words and careful movements, Kieran approached the nervous mare, who surprisingly didn't bolt again. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to take her reins. "You have a way with horses," Meredith observed as he led the animal back to her. "Had them all my life," he replied simply. He handed her the reins but kept a steadying hand on the bridle. "I don't think you should ride her back. She's still skittish." Meredith nodded, realizing he was right. The mare's eyes still showed too much white, her breathing not yet settled. "We can walk her back together," she suggested. "The ranch isn't far." As they began their slow journey, Meredith couldn't help but wonder what this stranger was doing on O'Connor land. The question must have shown on her face, because Kieran spoke before she could ask. "I'm looking for work," he explained. "Heard Thomas O'Connor might be hiring hands for the season." "My father," Meredith confirmed. "We are. The cattle drive to the railhead is coming up, and we've lost 3 men to the silver mines in Helena. Better pay, they claimed." Kieran nodded knowingly. "Mining's dangerous work for fools' dreams. I prefer open sky and honest labor." "Well, Mr. Hayes, after today's rescue, I believe I can put in a good word for you," Meredith said with a small smile. "I'd be obliged," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "And it's just Kier. Mr. Hayes was my father." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the rolling Montana landscape sprawling around them, golden in the late spring sunlight. The Bitterroot Mountains rose majestically in the distance, still capped with snow despite the warming days. "Where are you from, Kier?" Meredith asked, breaking the silence. It wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to be so forward with a man she'd just met, but she reasoned that the circumstances were unusual. "Texas originally. Been moving north with the seasons these past few years. Worked ranches in Wyoming, Idaho, now Montana." "A true wanderer," she observed. "For now," he agreed, his eyes scanning the horizon in a way that suggested he was always watching, always alert. "Though a man can only wander so long before he needs to find a place to set his roots." They crested a gentle hill, bringing the O'Connor ranch into clearer view, a handsome 2-story home, several outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse, all surrounded by rich grassland that seemed to stretch forever. "Your father's built something impressive," Kieran noted with genuine appreciation. Meredith felt a surge of pride. "He started with nearly nothing 20 years ago. My mother and he came out here when this was still just territory, not even a state yet." "And your mother?" Kieran asked. Meredith's expression softened with old grief. "Passed away 5 years ago. Influenza." "I'm sorry," he said simply, and something in his tone told Meredith he understood loss all too well. "Father and I manage," she continued after a moment, "along with my younger brother Daniel. He's 16 now, eager to prove himself a man." They were approaching the main yard when a tall man with graying red hair emerged from the barn, his stride purposeful as he spotted his daughter with a stranger. "That'd be your father, I reckon," Kieran said, straightening slightly. "Meredith." Thomas O'Connor called, his voice carrying the lilt of his Irish heritage even after decades in America. "What's happened?" His eyes darted between his daughter, her clearly distressed horse, and the unknown man at her side. "Father, this is Kieran Hayes," Meredith explained as they reached him. "My horse was spooked by a gunshot and threw me. Mr. Hayes caught me before I hit the ground. He quite likely saved my life." Thomas's expression shifted from concern to grateful surprise. He extended his hand to Kieran. "Then I owe you a debt I can't repay, Mr. Hayes." Kieran shook the offered hand firmly. "No debt, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone would have the speed or strength to catch a falling woman," Thomas countered, "or the skill to calm a panicked horse after. You're a horseman, clearly." "I've worked with them all my life," Kieran confirmed. "Actually, sir, I came looking for work. Heard you might need hands for the season." Thomas studied the younger man with an appraising eye. "Where'd you work last?" "Circle M in Idaho. Before that, the Rocking J in Wyoming." "I can provide references if needed." Thomas nodded slowly. "We'll discuss it after dinner. You'll join us tonight, of course." It wasn't a question but a statement of frontier hospitality. "I couldn't impose," Kieran began, but Thomas waved away his protest. "You saved my daughter. The least I can offer is a hot meal." He turned to Meredith. "Go on inside and have Mrs. Finch look you over. Make sure nothing's hurt that doesn't show." "I'm fine, Father, truly," Meredith insisted, though her body was beginning to feel the effects of her ordeal, muscles protesting the strain. "Humor an old man," Thomas said with gentle firmness. "Mr. Hayes and I will see to your horse." Recognizing the tone that brooked no argument, Meredith nodded and handed the reins to her father. "Thank you again," she said to Kieran, meeting his eyes briefly before turning toward the house. As she walked away, she couldn't help but glance back once, catching Kieran watching her. He quickly looked away, returning his attention to her father, but that brief connection sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper who had been with the family since before Meredith's mother passed, fussed over her appropriately, checking for injuries and insisting she take a warm bath to prevent stiffness. By the time Meredith had bathed and changed into a simple blue dress, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. From her bedroom window, she could see her father showing Kieran around the property, the two men walking with the ease of those who shared a common understanding of ranch work. There was something about the way Kieran carried himself, confident but not arrogant, strong but not intimidating, that captured her attention in a way no other man had. Meredith shook her head at her own foolishness. One dramatic rescue didn't make the man anything special. He was just another drifting cowboy looking for seasonal work, like dozens who had come before. By fall, he'd likely be gone, moving on to the next job, the next territory. Yet as she turned from the window to go downstairs, she couldn't quite shake the memory of those intense blue eyes looking into hers, or the feeling of absolute safety she'd experienced in his arms, however briefly. Dinner that evening was more lively than usual. Daniel peppered Kieran with questions about his travels, while Thomas discussed the upcoming cattle drive to the railhead in Helena. Meredith found herself watching Kieran when she thought no one was looking, noting how he spoke respectfully but not deferentially, how he answered questions directly without embellishment, and how, occasionally, his eyes would find hers across the table. "So you've never settled in one place?" Daniel asked between enthusiastic bites of Mrs. Finch's pot roast. "Not yet," Kieran replied. "Been moving with the work since I was about your age." "What about family?" the boy pressed, earning a warning look from his father. "Daniel, that's enough questions for our guest." But Kieran shook his head. "It's all right, sir. No family to speak of anymore. My mother died when I was young. Father tried his best but took sick during a harsh winter when I was 16. I've been on my own since." Meredith felt a pang of sympathy. "So young to be alone," she said softly. "There are harder fates," Kieran replied, his eyes meeting hers. "I've been fortunate to find good work and decent people most places I've landed." "Well, you'll find both here," Thomas assured him. "We pay fair wages, provide room and board in the bunkhouse, and expect honest work in return. The cattle drive starts in 3 weeks. Until then, we'll be rounding up strays, checking fences, and getting the herd ready to move." "Sounds fair," Kieran agreed. After dinner, the men retired to the porch with coffee. Meredith helped Mrs. Finch clear the table, her mind still occupied with thoughts of their new ranch hand. "He's a handsome one," Mrs. Finch observed with the directness of a woman who had known Meredith since childhood. Meredith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I hadn't noticed," she lied. The older woman's knowing smile said she wasn't fooled. "Of course not. Just like you haven't been stealing glances at him all through dinner." "Mrs. Finch," Meredith protested, though without real indignation. "I've known you since you were in braids, girl. I can read you like yesterday's newspaper." She patted Meredith's hand. "Just be careful with that heart of yours. Cowboys aren't known for putting down roots." With that gentle warning, Mrs. Finch carried a tray of coffee and a plate of her famous molasses cookies out to the porch, leaving Meredith to her thoughts. Later, as she prepared for bed, Meredith found herself once again at the window. The bunkhouse lights were still on and she could make out the silhouettes of the ranch hands. One figure stood slightly apart, looking up at the star-filled Montana sky. Even at a distance, she knew it was Kieran. "Don't be ridiculous," she whispered to herself, drawing the curtains closed. "He's just passing through like all the rest." But as she slipped between cool sheets, Meredith couldn't help but wonder what it might be like if, this time, the drifter decided to stay. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made the harsh Montana winters worthwhile. Meredith rose early, as was her habit, and went downstairs to help Mrs. Finch prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. It was a tradition her mother had started. The men ate in the bunkhouse most days, but Sunday mornings they were invited to the main house for a proper meal before the day's work. As she set the long table on the covered side porch, Meredith spotted the ranch hands making their way from the bunkhouse. Kieran walked among them, already seemingly at ease with men who'd worked the O'Connor ranch for years. He'd shaved, she noticed, and his dark hair was still damp from washing, curling slightly at his collar. "Morning, Miss O'Connor," called Frank Miller, the ranch foreman, tipping his hat as the men approached. "Good morning, Frank," she replied with a smile, then nodded to the others. "Breakfast is almost ready." Her eyes met Kieran's briefly, and he offered a small nod of greeting. In the clear morning light, she could see his eyes were not just blue but had flecks of gray, like the sky reflecting off steel. "How are you feeling today, miss?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear as the other men filed past them onto the porch. "Much better, thank you," she replied, surprised by his consideration. "Not even sore." "Good to hear." The corner of his mouth lifted in a hint of a smile, and then he followed the others. Breakfast was a lively affair, with the men discussing the day's work and sharing stories. Thomas sat at the head of the table, with Daniel at his right, already insisting he be allowed to participate in the roundup. Meredith noticed how Kieran listened more than he spoke, observing the dynamics of the ranch hands and only offering comments when he had something meaningful to add. When the meal ended, Thomas assigned the day's tasks. "Kier, you'll ride with me today. I want to show you the north boundary. We've had some trouble with strays wandering onto Blackwell property." Meredith saw a shadow cross Kieran's face at the mention of the Blackwell name. It was gone almost immediately, but it piqued her curiosity. "You know the Blackwells?" she asked as she collected his empty plate. Kieran shook his head. "Just the reputation. They have land in Wyoming too, not known for being neighborly." "That's putting it mildly," Thomas said with a frown. "Willard Blackwell's been trying to buy out every small rancher in the valley since he arrived 2 years ago. Those who won't sell have had mysterious problems: cut fences, scattered cattle, dried up water holes." "Nothing proven," Frank added quickly, "but mighty suspicious timing." "We've held our ground," Thomas continued. "The O'Connors have been here longer than most, and I intend for us to stay." The determination in her father's voice made Meredith proud, though she couldn't help the flutter of worry. The Blackwells had indeed brought trouble since their arrival, and the tension between the two ranches had been growing steadily. As the men prepared to set out for the day's work, Meredith found herself following Kieran to the barn, where he was saddling a bay gelding Thomas had assigned him. "Be careful riding with father today," she said, standing in the barn doorway. "The Blackwell hands can be confrontational." Kieran checked the cinch on his saddle before turning to look at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not one to start trouble, Miss O'Connor." "I didn't mean to imply, but I can finish it if needed," he added quietly, his eyes holding her steadily. Something about his calm confidence reassured her. Kieran Hayes was clearly a man who could handle himself, yet there was no bravado in his statement, just a simple fact. "Just come back safely," she said, surprising herself with the genuine concern in her voice. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Yes, madam." Meredith watched as he led the horse out to where her father was waiting, then turned back to her duties for the day. Sunday was typically quieter on the ranch, with only essential work being done. She would help Mrs. Finch with the household tasks, then perhaps have time for reading or working on the quilt she'd been piecing together for months. But as she went about her chores, Meredith found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to Kieran Hayes, wondering what he and her father might encounter at the boundary line, curious about his past, and confused by her own interest in a man who was, by his own admission, just passing through. The day passed slowly. By mid-afternoon, Meredith had finished her tasks and found herself restless. She decided to ride out to her favorite spot by the creek, a small, sheltered clearing where she often went to think or read. After yesterday's incident, she was a bit apprehensive about riding alone, but her mare seemed fully recovered from the fright, and Meredith refused to let fear dictate her actions. The clearing was as peaceful as always, dappled sunlight filtering through the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. Meredith spread a small blanket on the grassy bank and settled down with her book, though she found herself reading the same page multiple times as her mind wandered. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the approaching rider until he was almost upon her. Startled, she looked up to see Kieran dismounting from his horse. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, seeing her surprise. "Your father sent me to check the creek crossing after we finished at the boundary. I didn't expect to find anyone here." "It's all right," she assured him, closing her book. "This is ranch property after all." Kieran glanced at the title in her hands. "Jane Eyre." Meredith smiled, pleased that he recognized it. "Have you read it?" "During a particularly long winter in Wyoming," he confirmed, surprising her. "The rancher's wife had a small library. She let the hands borrow books when snow kept us inside." He hesitated, then asked, "May I?" gesturing to a spot on the blanket. It wasn't proper, Meredith knew, to be alone with a man like this. But they were on her family's land, in broad daylight, and something about Kieran's respectful demeanor made her nod. He sat at the edge of the blanket, leaving plenty of space between them, and removed his hat, setting it beside him. Without it, his face seemed younger, the dark hair falling across his forehead giving him an almost boyish appearance despite his weathered features. "How was the ride with my father?" Meredith asked, setting her book aside. "Educational," Kieran replied with a hint of a smile. "Your father knows every inch of this land. He's built something to be proud of." "He has," she agreed, "though it hasn't been easy, especially since Mother died." "It's clear he relies on you a great deal," Kieran observed. "Running a household this size is no small task." Meredith appreciated his recognition of her role. Too many men viewed women's work as trivial compared to the more visible labor of ranching. "I do what's needed," she said simply. "As we all do." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the creek's gentle burble and the occasional call of a meadowlark. "Did you encounter any Blackwell men today?" Meredith finally asked, her earlier concern returning. Kieran's expression darkened slightly. "We did." 3 riders watching from their side of the fence line. Your father nodded to them, but they didn't acknowledge him. "That's become typical," Meredith sighed. "It wasn't always this way. Before the Blackwells came, there was a kind of unspoken cooperation among the ranchers in the valley. During roundups, if someone found another's cattle, they'd be returned without question. During hard winters, neighbors helped neighbors. That's how it should be, Kieran agreed. Ranching's hard enough without making enemies. There was something in his tone that made Meredith curious. You sound like you've seen the consequences. Kieran picked up a small stone and tossed it into the creek, watching the ripples spread across the water's surface. My father's ranch in Texas was small, just enough to get by. A larger outfit wanted the land for water rights. When my father wouldn't sell, things got difficult. Cattle disappeared, fences were cut. He paused, his jaw tightening. One night our barn burned down. My father was inside trying to save the horses. Meredith's hand flew to her mouth. That's how he died. Kieran nodded once, his eyes on the distant mountains. The official story was that he knocked over a lantern, but there had been threats, and the fire started in 2 places at once. I'm so sorry, Meredith said softly, resisting an unexpected urge to reach out and touch his arm in comfort. It was a long time ago, he said, though the tension in his shoulders suggested the wound was still raw. But it taught me to recognize men like Willard Blackwell. They believe money and power give them the right to take what they want. Is that why you've never settled in one place? She asked. Because of what happened to your father, Kieran looked at her then, something vulnerable flashing in his eyes before his expression became guarded again. Partly, it's easier not to get too attached to any one place, or to people. Meredith ventured, instantly regretting the personal nature of the question, but Kieran didn't seem offended. That too, he admitted quietly. The confession hung between them, intimate in its honesty. Meredith found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way his hands calloused and capable rested on his knees. He was nothing like the polished young men from Helena, who occasionally came calling, with their rehearsed compliments and carefully controlled manners. There was something raw and real about Kieran Hayes that both unsettled and attracted her. The moment was broken by the distant sound of a dinner bell. Meredith glanced toward the ranch house, visible as a white shape through the trees. We should head back, she said, gathering her book and blanket. Mrs. Finch doesn't appreciate tardiness at Sunday dinner. Kieran stood and offered his hand to help her up. Meredith hesitated only briefly before accepting it, feeling the strength in his grip as he effortlessly pulled her to her feet. For a moment they stood closer than propriety allowed, her hand still in his, until Kieran gently released her and stepped back, picking up his hat. Thank you for sharing this place with me, he said, gesturing to the peaceful clearing. You're welcome, she replied, suddenly shy. Perhaps we can discuss Jane Eyre sometime, since you've read it. The smile that spread across his face transformed him, softening the hard edges and lighting his eyes. I'd like that, Miss O'Connor. Meredith, she said impulsively. You saved my life. I think you can call me Meredith. He nodded, placing his hat back on his head. Meredith, he repeated, as though testing the feel of her name. They rode back to the ranch side by side, talking easily about books they'd read and places they'd seen. By the time they reached the barn, Meredith felt a connection to Kieran that both excited and frightened her. Mrs. Finch's warning echoed in her mind. Cowboys aren't known for putting down roots. But as she watched him care for his horse before dinner, his movements efficient and gentle, Meredith couldn't help but wonder if this particular cowboy might someday find a reason to stay. The weeks leading up to the cattle drive passed in a blur of activity. Every hand on the ranch was busy from dawn until dusk, gathering cattle from the far reaches of O'Connor land, checking them for health issues, and preparing for the long journey to the railhead. Kieran quickly proved his worth, impressing even Frank Miller with his skill with horses and cattle. He worked tirelessly, often volunteering for the most difficult tasks without complaint. Thomas began to rely on him more and more, especially when dealing with the increasingly tense situation along the Blackwell boundary. Meredith found herself looking forward to the brief moments when their paths crossed at meals, during the Sunday gatherings, or the occasional chance meeting when her household duties took her to the barns or corrals. Their conversations were never long but always meaningful, and she discovered they shared similar views on many things, from books to the changing frontier. 2 days before the cattle drive was set to begin, Meredith was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard raised voices coming from the main corral. Curious, she moved closer, keeping out of sight behind the woodshed. 3 men on horseback sat just outside the corral fence. From their fine mounts and arrogant posture, she instantly recognized Blackwell men. Inside the fence, her father stood with Frank and Kieran, all 3 tense and watchful. "I'm only delivering a message, O'Connor," the lead rider was saying, a thin man with a waxed mustache whom Meredith recognized as Willard Blackwell's foreman, Hardin. "Mr. Blackwell's offering $15,000 for your spread. It's more than fair." "This land isn't for sale," Thomas replied firmly. "Not for $15,000 or $50,000. I've built this ranch from nothing and it stays in the O'Connor family." Hardin's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Blackwell thought you might say that. He asked me to remind you that getting cattle to market can be dangerous business. Lots of things can go wrong on a drive." The threat was thinly veiled, and Meredith saw Kieran step slightly closer to her father, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "You telling me Blackwell's planning to interfere with my drive?" Thomas demanded, his Irish temper flaring. "I'm not telling you anything of the sort," Hardin replied smoothly. "Just making conversation about the dangers of the trail. River crossings, stampedes, rustlers. All manner of trouble can find a herd." Frank muttered something Meredith couldn't hear, but Hardin's face darkened in response. "You do well to watch that mouth, Miller," he snapped. "Some men might take offense. And some men might do well to ride off Blackwell Ranch business before they find trouble they didn't come looking for," Kieran said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the tense silence. Hardin's attention shifted to Kieran, eyes narrowing. "Don't believe I know you, friend." "We're not friends," Kieran replied evenly. "And you know all you need to. I work for Mr. O'Connor." One of Hardin's companions leaned forward in his saddle. "I've seen you before, down in Wyoming territory. Hayes, ain't it?" Meredith saw a flicker of recognition cross Kieran's face before his expression went carefully neutral. "You're mistaken," he said flatly. The rider smirked. "No mistake. You worked the Rocking J when that trouble happened with the rustlers. 3 men died, as I recall." A cold feeling spread through Meredith's chest. Kieran had mentioned working at the Rocking J, but not any trouble involving deaths. She watched his face, seeing the tight control he was exercising. "You boys have delivered your message," Thomas interrupted, stepping between Kieran and the riders. "Now I'll thank you to get off my land." Hardin held Thomas's gaze for a moment longer, then tipped his hat with mocking politeness. "We'll tell Mr. Blackwell you're still being stubborn. Come on, boys." As they turned their horses, Hardin called back over his shoulder. "Give our best to your pretty daughter, O'Connor. Shame for a girl like that to be stuck out here in the middle of nowhere." The casual mention of her made Meredith's skin crawl, and she saw both her father and Kieran stiffen at the implied threat. But the Blackwell men were already riding away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension behind them. Meredith waited until they were well out of sight before stepping into view. Her father's face registered surprise, then concern. "How much did you hear?" he asked as she approached. "Enough," she replied. "They threatened the cattle drive." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair. "Blackwell's getting bolder. I don't like it." "We'll just need to be more vigilant on the drive," Frank said. "Extra guards at night, especially at river crossings." Thomas nodded in agreement, then turned to Kieran, who had been unnaturally quiet since the exchange. "What was that about Wyoming? Something I should know." Kieran met Thomas's gaze directly. "There was trouble with rustlers at the Rocking J. I was part of the crew that tracked them down. It turned violent." "And 3 men died," Thomas pressed. "Yes, sir, 2 rustlers and 1 ranch hand. You kill any of them?" Kieran's jaw tightened. "1. He was about to shoot the rancher's son. I had no choice." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Self-defense is no crime, but I don't like that Blackwell's men know something about you that I didn't." "I should have told you," Kieran acknowledged. "It wasn't something I'm proud of, necessary as it was." Meredith watched the exchange with a tight feeling in her chest. The man she was coming to know, thoughtful, gentle with animals, fond of literature, seemed at odds with someone who had killed in a range war. Yet she could see in his eyes that he carried the weight of that action heavily. "Well, what's done is done," Thomas finally said. "But from now on, I want complete honesty. We're going to have enough to worry about on this drive without surprises." "Yes, sir," Kieran agreed solemnly. As the men dispersed to return to their work, Meredith found herself walking alongside Kieran toward the barn, where he needed to check on a horse with a strained leg. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly when they were out of earshot of the others. Kieran glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You're asking if I'm all right after what you just heard? You said it was self-defense," Meredith replied simply. "I believe you." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "It was, but taking a life, it changes you. Makes you see things differently." They reached the barn door and Kieran paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "I'm not the man I want to be yet, Meredith, but I'm trying to be." The raw honesty in his voice moved her. Without thinking, she reached out and briefly touched his arm. "That's all any of us can do." For a moment, they stood there, connected by touch and understanding, until the sound of approaching footsteps made Meredith step back, suddenly aware of how inappropriate their proximity might appear to others. "I should get back to my chores," she said, smoothing her apron unnecessarily. Kieran nodded, his eyes still holding hers. "Thank you," he said simply, and Meredith knew he was thanking her for more than just the brief conversation. As she walked back to the house, Meredith found herself more confused than ever about her feelings for Kieran Hayes. He was complex in ways the other men she'd known were not, carrying shadows from his past, yet striving to move beyond them. And despite Mrs. Finch's warning, despite her own caution, Meredith couldn't deny that she was drawn to him in a way that both frightened and exhilarated her. That night at dinner, the conversation centered around final preparations for the cattle drive. Thomas would lead, with Frank as his right hand. 15 men would accompany the herd, including Kieran, and to his delight, Daniel, who had finally been given permission to participate in his first drive. "I need you to stay vigilant after we leave," Thomas told Meredith as they sat on the porch after the meal. "With Blackwell making threats, I don't like leaving you and Mrs. Finch here alone." "We'll be fine, Father," Meredith assured him, though she shared his concern. "Jim Stone's staying behind to watch the ranch, and the Petersons are just over the ridge if we need help." Thomas didn't look convinced. "All the same, keep the rifle by the door and don't hesitate to use it if necessary." The gravity in his voice made Meredith realize just how seriously he was taking the Blackwell threat. "I will," she promised. Later, as the household settled for the night, Meredith found herself once again at her bedroom window. The bunkhouse was dark except for one lamp still burning, its light casting a golden square onto the ground outside. As she watched, A figure emerged Kieran, easily recognizable even in the dim light. He walked to the corral fence and leaned against it, looking out at the night sky as had become his habit. Meredith wondered what thoughts occupied him on these solitary vigils. Was he thinking about the upcoming drive, about the confrontation with the Blackwell men, or perhaps about their conversation in the barn, where something unspoken had passed between them? As if sensing her gaze, Kieran suddenly looked toward the main house, his eyes finding her window with unerring accuracy. Meredith froze, caught in the act of watching him, but didn't step back. Instead, she raised her hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement. After a moment, Kieran returned the gesture, then tipped his hat slightly before turning back toward the bunkhouse. Meredith stayed at the window long after he had disappeared inside, her thoughts as vast and complex as the Montana night sky above. The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool, the ranch a flurry of activity as the final preparations were made. The herd, nearly 2,000 head of cattle, had been gathered in the holding pasture, their restless movements raising dust that hung in the air like a golden cloud in the early sunlight. Meredith was up before dawn, helping Mrs. Finch prepare a substantial breakfast for the men and packing supplies for the trail. The drive would take at least 2 weeks, possibly longer if the weather turned, or if they encountered any of the troubles Hardin had so ominously predicted. As she worked, Meredith tried to ignore the knot of worry in her stomach. Cattle drives were dangerous under the best circumstances. River crossings, stampedes, exhaustion, and accidents all posed significant risks. With Blackwell's thinly veiled threats, the dangers seemed magnified. Her father found her in the pantry checking supplies one last time. "Everything ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. Meredith nodded, forcing a smile. "All set. Mrs. Finch has outdone herself with the provisions." Thomas studied his daughter's face, seeing through her brave front. "We'll be fine, Meredith. The men are experienced and will be extra watchful." "I know," she said, though her concern remained. "It's just, be careful, Father. Blackwell isn't to be trusted." "No, he isn't," Thomas agreed grimly. "But neither am I a man to be intimidated on my own land." He pulled Meredith into a brief hug. "Take care of yourself while we're gone. I expect to find you safe and well when we return." "And I expect all of you back in one piece," she replied, returning his embrace. Outside, the men were mounting up, preparing to move the herd out. Daniel sat proudly on his pinto, trying to appear seasoned despite his obvious excitement. Frank was calling out last-minute instructions, his voice carrying across the yard. Meredith stood on the porch, watching as her father went to join them. Her eyes sought out Kieran, finding him adjusting his saddle on the bay gelding that had become his regular mount. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, their eyes meeting across the busy yard. After a moment's hesitation, Kieran rode over to the porch, stopping his horse a few feet away. "We'll be back before you know it," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'll hold you to that," Meredith replied, trying to keep her tone light despite the worry she couldn't fully hide. Kieran's expression softened. "I'll keep an eye on your father and Daniel." "You have my word." The simple promise meant more to Meredith than elaborate reassurances would have. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Safe travels, Kier." He touched the brim of his hat, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer. "Take care, Meredith." Then he was riding away to join the others, his straight-backed figure soon blending with the rest of the men as they began moving the herd toward the eastern horizon. Meredith remained on the porch long after they had disappeared from view, the dust cloud marking their progress gradually fading into the vast Montana sky. The ranch seemed eerily quiet in the days that followed. Jim Stone, An older hand with a bad knee who could no longer manage the rigors of a cattle drive, kept to himself mostly, checking fences and tending to the few horses left behind. Mrs. Finch busied herself with deep cleaning the house, a task she undertook whenever the men were away. Meredith found the silence unsettling after the constant activity of the past weeks. She threw herself into household projects she'd been postponing: mending, preserving the early summer berries, organizing her father's account books. But her thoughts constantly drifted to the drive, wondering where they were, if they'd reached the river crossing, if everyone was safe, if Kieran was safe. On the fourth day after the drive had departed, Meredith was in the garden harvesting peas when she heard horses approaching. Her heart leaped with hope that it might somehow be her father returning early, though she knew that was impossible, only to sink when she recognized the riders as Blackwell men. There were 3 of them, including Hardin, the foreman who had delivered Blackwell's offer days earlier. They rode boldly into the yard as if they owned it, stopping near where Meredith stood. "Afternoon, Miss O'Connor," Hardin called, removing his hat with mocking courtesy. "Fine day, isn't it?" Meredith straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "What do you want, Mr. Hardin?" "My father isn't here." "We know," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's precisely why Mr. Blackwell sent us to check on you. Neighborly concern, you understand." "How thoughtful," Meredith said dryly. "You can tell Mr. Blackwell I'm perfectly fine and require no assistance." Hardin's smile thinned. "Now, that's not very gracious, Miss O'Connor. Mr. Blackwell has taken a special interest in your welfare." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "In fact, he's asked me to extend an invitation. He's hosting a small gathering at his ranch house tomorrow evening and would be honored if you'd attend." "Please convey my regrets," Meredith replied coldly. "I have responsibilities here." One of the other riders, a burly man with a pockmarked face, chuckled. "Told you she'd be difficult, Hardin." "Now, Miss O'Connor," Hardin continued as if the interruption hadn't occurred, "Mr. Blackwell would be very disappointed. He's quite taken with you, you know. Has been since he first saw you in town last fall." The revelation that Willard Blackwell, a man at least 30 years her senior, known for his ruthless business practices, had been watching her made Meredith's stomach turn. "My answer remains no," she said firmly. Hardin's pretense of politeness dropped away. "Mr. Blackwell isn't accustomed to being refused, especially by women. He gets what he wants one way or another." Before Meredith could respond, the back door of the house banged open and Jim Stone emerged, rifle in hand. "Everything all right, Miss Meredith?" he called, his weathered face set in grim lines as he approached. "These gentlemen were just leaving," Meredith replied, not taking her eyes off Hardin. Hardin's gaze flicked to the rifle, then back to Meredith. "Think about that invitation, Miss O'Connor. Mr. Blackwell can be a powerful friend, or a dangerous enemy. Your father would be wise to consider that while he's on the trail with all those valuable cattle." The implied threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. Meredith's hands clenched in her apron, but she kept her voice steady. "Good day, Mr. Hardin." After a tense moment, Hardin replaced his hat. "We'll be seeing you again soon, Miss O'Connor. Count on it." With that, he wheeled his horse around and the 3 men rode out of the yard, kicking up dust as they went. When they were out of sight, Meredith's composure crumbled. She sank onto a nearby bench, her hands trembling. "Did they threaten you, miss?" Jim asked, lowering his rifle. "Not directly," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "But they made it clear that Mr. Blackwell has intentions toward me and that my father's cattle drive might face trouble if I don't comply with his invitation." Jim's weathered face hardened. "That ain't right. Blackwell's crossing lines he shouldn't." "What can we do?" Meredith asked, hating the helplessness she felt. "Father and the others are days away by now. I could ride after them," Jim offered. "Warn them to be extra careful." Meredith considered this but shook her head. "Your knee wouldn't hold up to that kind of ride, Jim, and I don't want to leave Mrs. Finch here alone." She stood, brushing off her skirt with hands that had stopped trembling. "No, we'll manage. I'll keep the rifle close and we'll be vigilant. Father knows to be careful already." Jim didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "I'll sleep in the barn then, be closer to the house if there's trouble." "Thank you," Meredith said gratefully. That night, unable to sleep, Meredith sat by her window, watching for any sign of riders returning. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the yard and making the shadows deeper by contrast. In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and haunting in the vast silence. Her thoughts turned to Kieran, wondering where he was under the same moon, if he was standing watch over the herd, or perhaps sleeping briefly before his turn at guard duty. The memory of his promise to watch over her father and brother comforted her, though she couldn't help wishing he were here instead. His steady presence a bulwark against Blackwell's threats. The days that followed passed intense anticipation. Meredith kept the rifle within reach at all times, and Jim made frequent patrols of the property. Blackwell's men did not return, but the knowledge that they might made each sunset bring renewed anxiety. A week after the cattle drive had departed, Meredith was hanging laundry when she heard a horse approaching at a gallop. Her heart raced as she dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and ran toward the front of the house, fearing news from the drive. To her shock, it was Kieran who rode into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat, dust covering his clothes. He swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped, his face grim as he caught sight of her. "Kieran," Meredith exclaimed, hurrying toward him. "What's happened?" "Is father all right?" "Daniel, they're fine," he assured her quickly, leading his exhausted horse toward the water trough. "But we've had trouble. Blackwell men have been shadowing the herd since we crossed onto the eastern range. 2 nights ago, they stampeded the cattle while we were crossing Peterson Creek." Meredith gasped. "Was anyone hurt?" "Minor injuries only, thank God. We managed to recover most of the herd, but we lost about 100 head in the confusion." Kieran removed his hat, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Your father sent me back to check on you. He was worried after what happened." Meredith felt a rush of relief that her family was safe, followed quickly by guilt that Kieran had been sent on such a hard ride because of her father's concern. "You must be exhausted. Come inside. Let me get you something to eat and drink." As they walked toward the house, Meredith briefly explained Hardin's visit and Blackwell's invitation. Kieran's expression darkened with each word, his jaw tightening in barely controlled anger. "So it's not just the ranch he's after," he said grimly as they reached the porch. "That explains a lot." Inside, Mrs. Finch fussed over Kieran, insisting he sit while she prepared a meal. Meredith poured him coffee, noticing how his hands were raw from the hard ride, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "How long did it take you to get back?" she asked. 2 days, he replied, gratefully accepting the coffee. "Rode straight through, only stopped to rest the horse when necessary." Meredith's eyes widened. The drive had been gone 9 days, and they'd been making steady but slow progress with the herd. For Kieran to return in just 2 days meant he'd pushed himself and his mount to the limit. "You shouldn't have risked it," she said softly. Kieran looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Yes, I should have. Your father was right to be concerned, and now I know he was justified." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and intense. "Meredith, Blackwell is dangerous. His men nearly killed 2 of our hands in that stampede, and I don't believe it was an accident." The gravity in his tone sent a chill through her. What do we do? Your father wants you to go stay with the Petersons until the drive returns, Kieran said. He thinks you'll be safer there. Meredith's chin lifted in determination. I won't be driven from my home. I thought you might say that, Kieran replied with a hint of a smile despite the seriousness of the situation. That's why I'm staying. Your father authorized me to remain here as protection until they return with the herd. Relief washed through Meredith at his words, though she tried not to show how much his presence comforted her. What about the drive? Won't they need you? Frank and your father can manage, Kieran assured her. With the herd already past the halfway point, the most dangerous sections are behind them. He didn't add what they both knew, that the real danger now was at the O'Connor ranch itself. Mrs. Finch brought a plate of food, and Kieran ate with the efficiency of a man accustomed to taking meals when they were available, not knowing when the next might come. As he ate, Meredith studied him, noting the new lines of fatigue around his eyes, the sunburn across his cheekbones, the way he occasionally flexed his right hand as if it pained him. You should rest after you eat, she said. You look ready to drop. Kieran shook his head. Need to check the property first, make sure everything's secure. Jim's been patrolling regularly, Meredith assured him. Nothing will change in the few hours you need to sleep. Mrs. Finch, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. The girl's right, Mr. Hayes. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Outnumbered, Kieran conceded with a tired smile. A few hours, then. After he had eaten, Meredith showed him to the small guest room off the kitchen. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. There's fresh water, she said, gesturing to the pitcher. And towels in the drawer. Is there anything else you need? Kieran stood in the center of the room, looking strangely out of place with his trail dust and gun belt in the neat domestic space. This is more than enough, he said. Thank you, Meredith. She should have left then, closed the door, and allowed him privacy. Instead, she found herself lingering, a question forming that she wasn't sure she should ask. Kieran, why did my father send you specifically? Frank could have spared one of the other hands. He met her gaze steadily. I volunteered. After what those Blackwell men said about you when they came to the ranch, I wanted to make sure you were safe. The simple admission sent warmth spreading through Meredith's chest. Thank you, she said softly, for coming back. Something shifted in Kieran's expression, a softening around his eyes. For a moment, Meredith thought he might step toward her, might say something more. But fatigue and propriety prevailed, and he merely nodded. Get some rest, she said, finally stepping back into the hallway. I'll wake you in a few hours. As she closed the door, Meredith leaned against it briefly, her heart beating faster than normal. The ranch still faced danger. Her father and brother were still far away with the herd, and Blackwell still posed a very real threat. Yet somehow, knowing Kieran Hayes was under the same roof made those problems seem less insurmountable. With a small, confused smile, Meredith pushed away from the door and went to find Jim. They needed to make plans, and there was work to be done. But for the first time in days, she felt something beyond worry and fear, a curious lightness that felt surprisingly like hope. Kieran slept for 4 hours, waking as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Meredith heard him moving about and went to the kitchen, where she found him fully dressed, his hat in hand as if preparing to leave. There's fresh coffee, she said, gesturing to the stove where a pot was keeping warm. Thank you, he replied, setting his hat aside to pour a cup. Has everything been quiet? Yes. Jim's been checking the boundary fences, but there's been no sign of Blackwell men. Kieran nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. That could change tonight. If I were planning something, I'd come after dark. The matter-of-fact way he said it sent a chill through Meredith, but she appreciated his honesty. "What should we do? First, I need to talk to Jim, get a better sense of the property. Then we'll make sure the house is secure. You and Mrs. Finch should stay inside after sunset." Meredith's chin lifted slightly. "I can handle a rifle, you know. Father made sure of that." A hint of a smile touched Kieran's lips. "I don't doubt it, but my job is to keep you safe, not put you in danger." "And my job is to protect this ranch," she countered. "We'll work together." Kieran studied her for a moment, then nodded in acknowledgement. "Fair enough. But you follow my lead if trouble comes." "Agreed," Meredith said, relieved he wasn't going to insist she stay completely out of any defense efforts. They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing. Jim showed Kieran the weakest points in the property's defenses, places where the fencing was older or where natural cover might allow someone to approach unseen. Together, the three of them developed a plan for keeping watch through the night. As dusk fell, Meredith helped Mrs. Finch prepare a simple dinner. The older woman had been unusually quiet all day, her normally cheerful demeanor subdued by the tension that had settled over the ranch. "You think they'll really come?" Mrs. Finch asked suddenly, her hands stilling in the act of kneading bread dough. Meredith hesitated, not wanting to increase the housekeeper's worry but unwilling to offer false reassurance. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but we're prepared if they do." Mrs. Finch nodded, resuming her kneading with more vigor than necessary. "That Hayes fellow," she said after a moment, "he seems to know what he's doing." "Yes," Meredith agreed, unable to keep a certain warmth from her voice. "He does." Mrs. Finch gave her a knowing look but said nothing more, turning her attention back to the bread. Meredith busied herself with setting the table, trying not to dwell on what the night might bring. Dinner was a quiet affair, the conversation limited to practical matters. Afterward, Jim took the first watch while Kieran checked and rechecked his revolver, cleaning it methodically at the kitchen table. "Where did you learn to handle guns?" Meredith asked, watching his capable hands work with practiced ease. "My father taught me the basics," Kieran replied, not looking up from his task, "but I really learned during the war." Meredith's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You fought in the war. You seem too young." "I was," he admitted. "Lied about my age to join up in '64. I was 16, though I told them I was 18. Fought for the Union in the last year of the conflict." "That's why you understand strategy," Meredith observed. "The way you've planned tonight's defenses." Kieran reassembled the revolver with quick, precise movements. "War teaches you things you wish you didn't need to know." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "But sometimes those lessons keep you alive later." There was something in his eyes, a shadow of old pain that made Meredith want to reach across the table and touch his hand. Instead, she asked, "Do you regret it? Joining so young?" Kieran seemed to consider the question carefully. "I regret that war was necessary at all," he said finally. "But no, I don't regret going. I believed in what we were fighting for, still do." The simple conviction in his voice stirred something in Meredith. In a world where men often proclaimed grand principles while acting contrary to them, Kieran Hayes seemed to live by his beliefs, however quietly. A sudden noise from outside, the sound of Jim's signal, 2 short whistles interrupted their conversation. Kieran was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand. "Stay inside," he instructed, moving to the window. "Away from the doors and windows." Meredith's heart raced as she followed his directive, retreating to the center of the kitchen where Mrs. Finch was already standing, her face pale in the lamplight. They listened as Kieran slipped out the back door, his footsteps fading as he moved toward the front of the house where Jim was posted. Long minutes passed in tense silence. Meredith found herself straining to hear any sound from outside, her imagination conjuring images of confrontation and violence that made her stomach knot with fear. Just when she thought she couldn't bear the waiting any longer, the back door opened, and Kieran returned. "False alarm," he said, though his expression remained alert. Jim thought he saw riders approaching from the east, but it was just shadows and moonlight playing tricks. Relief flooded through Meredith, making her knees momentarily weak. "Thank goodness. Don't let your guard down," Kieran cautioned, checking his watch. "If they come, it will likely be later when they think we might be asleep." Mrs. Finch, who had been silent throughout the alarm, suddenly spoke up. "I've got a kettle of coffee brewing. Seems like it might be a long night." Kieran gave her a grateful smile. "Much appreciated, Mrs. Finch." As the night wore on, the initial tension eased somewhat, though vigilance remained. Jim came in for coffee and a brief rest around midnight, reporting all quiet outside. Kieran took his turn at watch, leaving Meredith and Mrs. Finch alone in the kitchen. "You should try to sleep, dear," Mrs. Finch suggested. "No sense in all of us being exhausted tomorrow." Meredith shook her head. "I couldn't sleep now if I tried." The older woman studied her with knowing eyes. "It's not just the danger keeping you awake, is it?" Heat rose to Meredith's cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Mrs. Finch replied gently. "I've known you since you were a little girl, Meredith O'Connor. I can see when your heart's engaged, even if you're not ready to admit it to yourself." Meredith looked down at her hands, finding no words to deny the observation. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "He's not staying. He told me himself he doesn't put down roots." "People change," Mrs. Finch said simply. "When they find something worth changing for." Before Meredith could respond, a shot rang out in the night, followed quickly by another. Both women froze, eyes wide with alarm. "That came from the north pasture," Meredith said, already moving toward the rifle that stood by the door. "Meredith, don't," Mrs. Finch began, but Meredith had already grabbed the weapon and was heading for the back door. Outside, the night was silver with moonlight, making the shadows between buildings appear darker by contrast. Meredith moved carefully, staying close to the house, straining to hear any sound beyond the pounding of her own heart. A figure emerged from the darkness near the barn, and Meredith raised the rifle instinctively before recognizing Jim's familiar gait. "Jim," she called in a harsh whisper. "What's happening?" The old ranch hand hurried toward her, his own rifle in hand. "Blackwell men," he confirmed grimly. "At least 4 of them. They were trying to get to the horses when Kieran spotted them. Gunfire erupted and they scattered." "Where's Kieran now?" Meredith asked, fear clutching at her chest. "Last I saw, he was heading toward the north fence line, tracking one of them." Jim's weathered face was taut with concern. "I lost sight of him after that." Another shot sounded, this one more distant, followed by what might have been a shout. Meredith's grip tightened on her rifle. "Go back to the house," Jim urged. "I'll find Kieran." "No," Meredith said firmly. "We stay together, safety in numbers." Jim looked like he wanted to argue but nodded reluctantly. "Stay behind me then, and for God's sake, be careful." They moved cautiously across the yard, keeping to the deepest shadows. The moon had passed its zenith, beginning its descent toward the western horizon, but still provided enough light to see by. The night was eerily quiet now, the earlier gunshots having silenced even the nocturnal creatures that usually filled the darkness with sound. They had almost reached the north pasture when a figure appeared suddenly before them. Meredith's finger tightened on the trigger before she recognized Kieran. His face was grim in the moonlight, a streak of what looked like blood darkening one cheek. "Are you hurt?" she asked immediately, lowering her rifle. "It's not mine," he replied, his voice tight. "One of them is down by the fence line, the others retreated but might regroup." "Did you recognize any of them?" Jim asked, Kieran nodded once. Hardin was leading them. I heard him giving orders before they realized I was there. The confirmation that Blackwell's foreman was directly involved sent a chill through Meredith. This was no random attack by outlaws. This was a deliberate strike against the O'Connor ranch, likely aimed at intimidating her into accepting Blackwell's invitation. "We need to get back to the house," Kieran said, his tone brooking no argument. They might circle around and try again from another direction. As they turned back toward the main buildings, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood from the fence post just inches from Kieran's head. He reacted instantly, pushing Meredith down behind the meager cover of a water trough while returning fire in the direction the shot had come from. "Stay down," he ordered, his body positioned to shield her as more shots came, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the darkness at the edge of the property. Jim had taken cover behind a stack of lumber, his rifle barking in response to the incoming fire. The exchange was brief but intense, bullets whining through the air and thudding into wood around them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Meredith's ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in her ears. "Are they gone?" she whispered after a moment. Kieran remained tense, still scanning the darkness. "Maybe, or they could be repositioning." He glanced down at her, his face half in shadow. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she managed, though her heart was racing so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "You?" "Fine," he replied shortly, but Meredith noticed he was favoring his left arm slightly. "You're hurt," she said, reaching toward him. "It's nothing. Bullet grazed me earlier." He shifted, peering over the edge of the water trough. "I think they're pulling back." "Jim, can you see anything from your position?" The older man shook his head. "Nothing moving out there, but that doesn't mean they're gone for good." "We need to get to the house," Kieran decided. "It's more defensible than our current position. When I give the signal, run for the back door." "I'll cover you." Meredith wanted to protest that she shouldn't go first, that she could help provide covering fire, but the determined set of Kieran's jaw told her this wasn't a point he would yield on. She nodded reluctantly. "On my mark," Kieran said, checking his revolver. "Ready. Go." Meredith surged to her feet and ran, her skirts hampering her stride as she dashed across the open yard toward the house. She could hear Jim following, his footsteps heavier than hers. Behind them, Kieran moved more slowly, walking backward with his gun trained on the darkness beyond the fence line. They reached the back door without incident, and Meredith fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Once inside, Jim quickly barred the door while Kieran moved to check the front of the house. Mrs. Finch was in the kitchen, her face ashen with fear. "Thank God," she breathed when she saw them. "I heard the shooting and thought," she broke off, unable to finish the thought. "We're all right," Meredith assured her, though her voice wasn't entirely steady. "But Kieran's been hurt." "It's just a graze," Kieran insisted as he returned from his inspection of the front rooms. "The house is secure, no sign of them approaching from the front." Despite his protests, Meredith insisted on examining his injury. The bullet had indeed just grazed his upper arm, tearing his shirt and leaving a shallow furrow across the muscle. It had bled enough to soak his sleeve but wasn't serious. "It needs cleaning at least," she said firmly, already gathering supplies from the medicine cabinet. Kieran submitted to her ministrations with reluctance, sitting stiffly at the kitchen table while she cleaned the wound with carbolic solution and wrapped it with a clean bandage. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against his skin, warm and alive beneath her touch. "Thank you," he said quietly when she had finished. Meredith nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The reality of the night's events was beginning to sink in the genuine danger they had faced. the knowledge that men had come with the intention of doing harm. And beneath that, the realization of how quickly Kieran had moved to protect her, putting his own body between her and the bullets without hesitation. Jim, who had been keeping watch at the window, spoke up. "Sun will be up in a couple of hours." If they were going to try again, they'd have done it by now. "Probably," Kieran agreed, "but we'll stay alert until full light." He looked at Meredith, his expression softening slightly. "You should rest. You've had quite a night." "So have you," she countered. "And you're the one who's been shot." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Barely. I've had worse scratches from rose thorns." Despite the gravity of the situation, Meredith found herself returning his smile. Something had shifted between them during the night's events, a deepening of connection that went beyond words. As dawn gradually lightened the eastern sky, turning the darkness to pale gray, then soft gold, the tension in the house eased. Jim made a careful patrol of the property, reporting that the Blackwell men had indeed gone, leaving behind only hoof prints and spent cartridges as evidence of their visit. One grim reminder remained: the body of the man Kieran had shot during the initial confrontation. He wasn't one of Blackwell's regular hands, but looked to be a hired gun brought in specifically for this purpose. "What do we do about him?" Jim asked as they stood looking down at the body, now visible in the morning light. "Bury him," Kieran said simply. "Not much else we can do." Meredith nodded in agreement. Whatever the man's sins, leaving him unburied wasn't an option. "I'll help," she offered. They chose a spot far from the house at the edge of the property where the land began to slope toward the creek. The work was grim but necessary, and no one spoke much as they dug into the hard Montana soil. When it was done, Meredith said a brief prayer, more for their own consciences than for the stranger who had come to do them harm. As they walked back to the house, Kieran fell into step beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself well last night," he said finally. "Not everyone would have kept their head in that situation." "I was terrified," Meredith admitted, "but there wasn't much choice but to keep going." "That's courage," Kieran replied. "Not the absence of fear, but continuing despite it." The simple compliment warmed her more than elaborate praise might have. "What happens now?" she asked as they neared the house. Kieran's expression hardened. "Blackwell crossed a line last night. Sending men with guns onto your property, shooting with intent to harm, that's not just business rivalry anymore. You think he'll try again? Maybe not right away. He'll wait to see the fallout from this attempt first." Kieran glanced toward the eastern horizon, where the sun now cleared the distant hills. "Your father and the others should be reaching Helena in the next few days. Once the cattle are sold, they'll be heading back." "And then?" Meredith pressed. Kieran's jaw tightened. "Then decisions will need to be made. This can't continue, Meredith. Blackwell won't stop until he gets what he wants, either the ranch or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They both knew the unspoken alternative. "I won't be intimidated out of my home," Meredith said firmly, echoing her earlier sentiment. "And I certainly won't be coerced into becoming Willard Blackwell's, whatever it is he thinks I should be." "No," Kieran agreed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You shouldn't be." Something in his tone made Meredith look up at him. His eyes were intense, fixed on her face with an expression that made her breath catch. "Meredith," he began, then hesitated, as if searching for words. "Last night when the shooting started, all I could think about was keeping you safe. Not the ranch, not the horses, just you." The admission hung between them, simple yet profound in its implications. Meredith felt her heart quicken, hope and uncertainty warring within her. "I've been on my own a long time," Kieran continued, his voice low and earnest. "Moving from place to place, never staying long enough to care too much about anyone or anything. It seemed safer that way after everything that happened with my father. He paused, looking out across the ranch that was just coming alive with the day's first activities: chickens pecking in the yard, horses nickering in the corral, the smoke from the chimney rising straight in the still morning air. But being here, working this land, knowing you. He met her eyes again. It's made me question whether that's really living at all. Meredith's throat felt tight with emotion. What are you saying, Kieran? I'm saying that I care what happens to you, Meredith O'Connor, more than I expected to. More than is probably wise, given the circumstances. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. And I'm saying that I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, even if that means facing Blackwell directly. It wasn't quite a declaration of love. They both knew it was too soon for that, but it was an acknowledgement of something growing between them, something with the potential to become more if given the chance. I care about you too, Meredith said softly. And I'm grateful you came back when you did. But I don't want you risking your life because of Blackwell's obsession with our ranch or with me. Kieran's expression softened, a small smile touching his lips. Some things are worth the risk, Meredith. Before she could respond, Jim called from the house, breaking the moment. Riders coming. From the east. Instantly alert, they hurried to where Jim stood on the porch, pointing toward a dust cloud visible on the horizon. Kieran shaded his eyes, studying the approaching riders. Too many for Blackwell men, he observed, and coming from the wrong direction. As the riders drew closer, details became visible: a group of perhaps 10 men, driving a small herd of cattle before them. Meredith's heart leaped with recognition. It's father, she exclaimed. And Daniel. But they're early. The drive shouldn't be back for at least another week. Jim nodded in agreement. Something's happened. They waited anxiously as the riders approached, the small herd of cattle far fewer than had left with the drive, lowing tiredly as they were guided toward the home pasture. Thomas O'Connor rode at the head of the group, his normally straight posture slightly slumped with exhaustion. Beside him, Daniel looked equally worn, his young face grimmer than Meredith had ever seen it. As they reached the yard, Thomas spotted Meredith and the others waiting. Relief visibly washed over his features, and he urged his horse forward, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who had spent too many hours in the saddle. Meredith, he said, embracing her tightly. Thank God you're safe. We are, she assured him, returning his embrace before stepping back to look at him with concern. But what happened? Why are you back so early, and where are the rest of the cattle? Thomas's expression darkened. Blackwell happened. His men were waiting for us at Cottonwood Crossing, just outside Helena. They stampeded the herd right as we were about to ford the river. We lost nearly half the cattle, drowned or scattered beyond recovery. Anyone hurt? Kieran asked, stepping forward. Frank took a bullet in the shoulder, Thomas replied grimly. He's with the doctor in Helena. 3 other hands had minor injuries. It was awful, Daniel added, his young voice tight with anger. They shot right into the herd, spooked them deliberately. If Kieran hadn't warned us to be extra vigilant, it might have been worse. Thomas looked at Kieran, his expression shifting to one of gratitude and then concern as he noticed the bandage visible beneath the torn sleeve. You've had trouble here too, I see. Briefly, Kieran and Meredith recounted the events of the previous night. Thomas's face grew increasingly grim as he listened, his hands clenching into fists. This has gone far enough, he said when they had finished. Blackwell's not just trying to buy us out anymore, he's actively trying to destroy us. And now, he's made his intentions toward my daughter clear as well. The other ranch hands had gathered around, their faces showing varying degrees of anger and determination. These were men who had worked the O'Connor ranch for years, who considered it home and its owner's family. "What do you want us to do, boss?" one of them asked, voicing what all were thinking. Thomas looked around at the loyal faces before him, then at his daughter and son. Finally, his gaze settled on Kieran, who stood slightly apart, his stance relaxed but alert. "First, we rest," Thomas decided. "Everyone's exhausted. We'll talk strategy after we've had food and sleep." He turned to Meredith. "Ask Mrs. Finch to prepare whatever she can manage for these hungry men. Then I want you to go into town and send a telegram to the marshal in Helena. It's time the law knew exactly what's happening here." Meredith nodded, but Kieran stepped forward. "She shouldn't go alone," he said. "Not with Blackwell's men in the area." "I'll go with her," Daniel volunteered quickly. Thomas considered this, then shook his head. "No, Kieran's right. Blackwell's men know Daniel was with the drive. They might be watching for any of us." He looked at Kieran. "You go with her. Your newer might not be as recognizable yet." "Yes, sir," Kieran agreed. As the ranch hands dispersed to care for the tired horses and settle the remaining cattle, Meredith found herself walking beside Kieran toward the house. "So much for having a few days of peace before the next confrontation," she said quietly. "Blackwell's escalating things," Kieran observed. "The attack on the cattle drive so close to market, the raid here last night, he's getting desperate." "Or more confident," Meredith countered. "He might think he's winning, weakening us to the point where Father will have no choice but to sell." Kieran's expression was grim as they reached the porch. "Either way, this ends soon, one way or another." The gravity in his voice sent a shiver through Meredith. She knew he was right. The conflict with Blackwell had reached a point where resolution was inevitable. She only hoped that, when the dust settled, those she cared about would still be standing.